think I got, okay, it did. I'm not sure if I got the switch on the mic, but I'm hearing it and I definitely did. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you guys so much for welcoming me into your congregation this morning. I'm really excited to be here. So Kendall already mentioned this, but I am here today because it's Theological Education Sunday, a time when seminaries send out their students to tell congregations about how great seminary is. And I know this wasn't the intention, but the Genesis passage today is a great way for me to share my own experiences in seminary. So I have to thank whoever put that list of scriptures together for the year, because I'm really excited to share with you all some of what I've learned in seminary, and also the many amazing ways in which God's call got me there. But before we get into that, I want to take some time to look at our text for today. This chapter in Genesis follows the story of the Tower of Babel, and at the very end of chapter 11, we get a quick review of Abraham's lineage. However, even with that reminder of who Abraham's related to, the beginning of chapter 12 feels really abrupt. It's almost as if we have been dropped into the middle of a conversation, a very important conversation. We encounter God telling Abraham, "I have plans for you." And in this story, Abraham doesn't even respond. Instead, God makes a big proclamation. "I will bless the people who will bless you. I will curse the people who will curse you. And you will be the father of God's nation." As I read this passage for today, the first image that sprang to my mind was one of God talking and Abraham just nodding in agreement. And why wouldn't he? He's entering into a covenant with God in which he is being promised the whole world. And not just the whole world that he's living in, but the whole world for all the generations that will come from him. And that seems like a pretty sweet deal to me. But then comes the addendum to God's promise. Yes, Abraham will be the father of God's nation. However, in order to do that, he has to agree to pack up his bags and move his family away from his home to a foreign place. God has entered into a covenant with Abraham, a covenant that includes God calling Abraham to a new home. And again, in the passage, Abraham seems pretty okay with the whole thing. By the end of the reading, he is well on his way. I wish I could relate to what we hear in the Bible passage today. I am so envious of Abraham. God's call feels so obvious. God basically says, if you do what I want, you will get this in exchange. And at first blush, the story of Abraham's call from God seems so straightforward, so blissfully clear. But then again, I wonder if maybe the writers decided to leave a little bit out. Was Abraham really that willing? Was there some back and forth in which he said, "I hear you, God. That sounds pretty amazing. But why can't you do that and let me stay in my home?" Or, in my opinion, even worse, "God, that's great, but there's no way that Sarah will go for it." Maybe there's a backup plan we could try out. Perhaps there's more bargaining involved in that story than we get to see. I'm not Abraham, but I know my own call from God has involved doubt and questions. While I've certainly felt God moving in my life, I can't remember a time when I felt God speaking directly into my ear, a time when God's plan was as obvious as it feels in the call to Abraham. As I mentioned just a little bit earlier, I was asked to come here to share a little bit of who I am and how I ended up at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which I will be calling Austin Seminary from here on out because Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary is a big mouthful. So what better way to share my experiences than to offer up my own call story? A story in which I was, not as obviously, called to pack up my bags and move. Don't misunderstand me, God has made no promises of a great nation coming from my family line, but I do think that God has promised to work through me, and in exchange, I have to be willing to go where God is calling me. You may have already read this in the brief bio in the back of your bulletin, but I'm going to repeat it. I am a senior at Austin Seminary. In May, if all goes well, which I'm hoping it will, I will be graduating with a Master's in Divinity, and by August of next year, I will be ready to receive a call ministering to a congregation, which is really exciting considering how often I've dug my heels in when God has called me. I grew up Presbyterian. I was raised at Eastminster Presbyterian Church in Dallas. I attended all the church activities growing up. I went to youth conferences, mission trips, and church walk-ins. I was at church every Sunday, both Sunday school and the 11 o'clock worship service. And in the spring of my senior year of high school, I declared to my parents that there was no way I was going to church in college. At 18, I was burned out on all things church. I was also thoroughly set on not living into the future that so many adults in my life were predicting for me. My poor father made the terrible mistake of telling a 16-year-old me, I think you're going to work in the church one day. I love my dad, but the last thing I wanted to do was prove him right. So I made a resolution that I was never going to work in the church, because why in the world would I help his predictions come true? Then, the summer after my freshman year of college, I was asked to help at Junior High Jubilee at Mo Ranch. And God certainly does work in mysterious ways. Spending a week with a bunch of angsty, prepubescent middle schoolers is what did the trick. I walked away from that conference overwhelmed by God's grace and love. In a single week, I'd gotten to see how God works through all of us. And I saw that maybe God was working through me too. Driving back to Dallas from Mo Ranch, I realized that perhaps I was called to ministry, and perhaps God knows what God is up to. It did take 6 more years before I finally enrolled at Austin Seminary. Even after feeling that initial call to ministry, I made a concerted effort to dig my heels in and ignore it. First, I graduated from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, and I realized going into my senior year of college that the last thing I wanted to do was step back into a classroom. It didn't mean I was any less called. It just meant that I needed some time to be out in the world, working and living, before getting back into the paper writing and reading mode that is required of grad school. After I graduated from undergrad, I moved to New Orleans to serve as a young adult volunteer, which is an amazing year-long volunteer program through the Presbyterian Church. I highly recommend it to any young adult who's struggling to find how God is calling them in their lives. And I'm more than happy to offer more details after the service if you can think of someone who would benefit from the program. So initially, I figured I would spend a year in New Orleans before heading on to seminary, but within 6 weeks of arriving there, I knew I needed more than a year to get to know that city. I felt like I'd barely scratched the surface. And after all, if becoming a minister really was my calling, what was the rush? Which is to say that God is very patient. I loved my time in New Orleans. It's such a culturally and historically rich place. Every time I go to visit and I see the big oak trees covered in Spanish moss, I get goosebumps because it feels like I'm coming home. I like to think of New Orleans as the place where I became an adult. Whenever people ask me where I'm from, I tell them I was raised in Dallas, but that I really grew up while I lived in New Orleans. And God is patient, but when it comes to being called, God does not wait forever. As I began my third year in New Orleans, I knew that my time there was coming to a close. I was being called to become a minister, and that meant heading back into the classroom to learn biblical Hebrew and Greek, to study the writings of John Calvin and Karl Barth, to really do the work of building a strong base that will help me follow God's call in serving a congregation. I like to joke that my time in New Orleans was me ignoring God's call, and I'm sure in many ways I was gently sidelining that call to ministry. However, I also think that my time in New Orleans will help me be a better minister in ways that I can't even begin to understand right now. I don't think that God was absent during my time there. Instead, I think I had the chance to encounter God in a new place with new people, which has given me a deeper perspective. So after 3 years of parades and jazz music and Saints games, it was time to come back to Texas. It was time to buckle down and do the work of fulfilling God's call. In the biblical passage today, God calls Abraham, but Abraham still has to agree to participate. He has to be open to hearing God's call, and he has to be willing to say, "This is risky, but you are calling me, so I will trust in you." Seminary is challenging. Every day I'm expected to not only think critically about what I'm studying, but I'm also challenged to bring God into every space. When I'm asked to translate some Greek for my class on the book of Philippians, it's easy to feel like it's an exercise in academia. Basically, an opportunity to prove to everyone else how smart I am. But then, after doing the hard work of figuring out what nouns are in what whatevers, my pastor looks at me, who's also my professor, and he says, "What does this passage mean pastorally? Why does it matter? Why are we doing it?" On really hard days, when I'm overscheduled and underprepared, I find comfort in the fact that God has called me to seminary. Even with all my flaws and faults, God is working through me and always surprising me. I know that I've spent most of this sermon talking about my time in seminary, and I can tell you plenty more if you want to come find me afterwards. But I want you all to know that I didn't expect to have this call, and I'm willing to bet that each of you are called by God to something special too. It doesn't mean that all of you are called to seminary. I think God could call us to many different things in the many different seasons of our lives. So no, I promise, this is not a pitch to attend seminary. Instead, I would challenge you all to try and find the ways in which you can participate in God's call. It's exciting, it's kind of scary, and I imagine I'm not the only one who struggles to trust in it. But at the end of the day, God is calling each and every one of us, and it only works if we're willing to meet God in that call. So take some time, listen for God, and stick your neck out there. Just as God's plans for Abraham were wildly beyond even God's description in this passage, God's plans for you are greater than you can begin to fathom. You just have to be ready to be a part of them.